Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Joel Mokyr, who is a professor of economics and history at Northwestern University and professor of economics at the University of Tel Aviv. He specializes in economic history and the economics of technological change and population change. His most recent book is A Culture of Growth. He has authored over 100 articles and books in his field. Welcome, Joel.
Hello.
I want to start with your recent paper, Attitudes, Aptitudes, and the Roots of the Great Enrichment, in which you say attitudes, that is cultural beliefs, and aptitudes, that is technical competence, played central roles in the British Industrial Revolution and the origins of modern growth. You say one might ask if we could see these as necessary or sufficient conditions, and the answer depends a bit on whether we try to explain a few isolated inventions in the cotton and iron industry or really look at the Industrial Revolution more holistically. You want to talk a bit about that, why you believe attitudes and aptitudes played a big role?
Yeah, well, it will take a while, but I'll do my best to summarize this essay. I mean, this essay really summarizes much of what I've been doing for the last 10 years or so, including the book that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I would not for a minute claim that the arguments I'm making in that paper completely summarize everything that mattered, because I think what happens is that the Industrial Revolution and the sort of Great Enrichment that followed it, and that we are all beneficiaries of, really was a result of the confluence of a whole bunch of factors. And so it's not clear which of these were sufficient conditions. It's as if you were sort of growing an apple. All right. So what do you need to go and have an apple? Well, is it necessary for somebody to have to plant the tree? And the answer is yes. But then there's a whole bunch of other things. It has to rain the right kind. You have to fertilize. You have to, of course, pollinate the flowers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that come in. And at the end, what you have is an apple. And you can ask yourself which of these was a necessary condition. And clearly, if you don't plant a tree, then you're not going to have apples. But if you plant a tree and then you don't do all these other things, you may not have apples either. So, I think this is basically what's happened here. We're looking at this fantastic outcome that's probably the most significant change in economic history since the invention of agriculture. Because until about 1800, the vast bulk of the human race in abject poverty. Yeah. And the fact that we are now living at a very high living standard, far above what's needed for subsistence, basically everywhere, but certainly in the majority of humanity, that I think is a departure that even in 1800, nobody would have believed could ever happen. Not Adam Smith, not Malthus, not Ricardo, not even John Stuart Mill. The great minds of economics always were convinced that in the end, much of the human race would remain mired in poverty. And to everybody's surprise, so to speak, we were able to sort of pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and provide a living standards. And even in countries that we think are relatively poor, the vast bulk of people, they don't just have enough food. They have motorcycles, they have televisions, they have, smartphones. They eat much better than their great grandfathers did. So the Great Enrichment really is a global phenomenon. But it's also clear that it started in Europe. And the question is, what exactly was it in Europe that got this snowball rolling? And so what I argue in that paper is that one of the important things that you have to realize is that events like that are driven by a fairly small number of people. It is really 95% of the population up in, say, 1700 were still peasants, most of them probably illiterate. And these people had very little room and very little ability to bring about the kind of changes that you needed for an industrial revolution. So you're looking at a small group of people which has two components. One of them is what we would call today, they would never use that term, but we would call today intellectuals. Okay, so these are people that they would call natural philosophers. These were people who were doctors. These are people who were astronomers, mathematicians, that kind of people. And the other group, which is also fairly small, is the crème de la crème of the artisans. These are people that they would call engineers, millwrights, high-quality artisans, clockmakers, watchmakers, instrument makers. But, most artisans were fairly crude carpenters and, weavers. But within the population of artisans, there's a bunch of people who are really, really, really good. And it's the intellectuals and the top of the artisans who, between the two of them, created the Industrial Revolution. So let me first talk a little bit more about the intellectuals. So Europe certainly does not have a monopoly on intellectual activity and creativity, say in 1500. I mean, in many ways, I would think that the level of intellectual activity, just in terms of intellectuals coming together, talking to each other, teaching each other, in China, in the Islamic world, in India, is probably, if not higher, certainly as high as it is in Europe. And yet we don't see anything like an industrial revolution happening in these other civilizations. So what's different about European intellectuals that's not that you can, from other intellectual societies elsewhere in the world? And so there's sort of three things that I point to. The first is, I think, that Europeans already in the late Middle Ages, more and more, I would think, after the invention of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century, are able to free themselves from what I would call intellectual ancestor worship. And the notion that somehow all knowledge has been revealed to our forefathers many generations ago, and that we are just basically following them. And if you want to be wise, all you have to do is read their writings. Okay, that's a very deep concept that you find in many civilizations, of course, including Europe to some extent. And so it is very strong in Islamic civilization, where there's a growing concentration on reading the Quran and the Hadith, which are the later writings of Muhammad. You see the same happening in China with the Neo-Confucian revolution during the Song period. You see it very among Jewish civilization in Europe, in which basically you want to know something, go read the writings of earlier civilizations, and you will find the answer. If you haven't found it, you haven't looked deep enough.
This is what you're calling the attitude, right?
Yes, that's an attitude. The attitude is what I call intellectual ancestor worship. And what is so striking about Europe is that at some point, I would say somewhere in the late 15th century, maybe you can find it a little bit earlier if you dig deep enough, but it becomes very common after 1500, is that people basically abandon the intellectual ancestor worship, and they become increasingly critical of the heritage of classical civilization. So, what happens, of course, in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance is people increasingly discover the writings of Roman and Greek sages. Some of them through manuscript that they discover, and some of them through translations from Arabic. But basically, they discover this heritage, and they say, "Oh, wow, these people really knew a lot." And then they teach this stuff. Okay, so Aristotle is a little bit earlier, but then they find all these other writers, Galenus in medicine, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
And the odd thing is that at some point they're starting to scratch their head and say, "Wait a minute, is this right?" And then they start realizing that a lot of the stuff that the ancients believed in, particularly Aristotle, who is, of course, the be-all and end-all of much of science, are just not right. And they start correcting it. And sort of I would say, at some point, whether this is at the time of Galileo or Copernicus, it depends which field you're talking about, they slowly come to the realization that this stuff is to a large extent wrong, and they can do better. And they start...
So this is so in the article you say, Joel, that the veneration for ancient knowledge had a distinct dampening effect on the ability of society to experience knowledge progress, since it imposed constraints on what new knowledge was and was not permissible. So what you're saying here is this was distinctly different in Europe compared to other comparably advanced societies at that time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I think is really a very striking phenomenon. And not all groups in Europe follow this, obviously. There's a lot of resistance to this, and there's this whole, what the French call the querelle des anciens et des modernes. There's this struggle between the ancients and the moderns. The ancients are the people who say, we are nothing compared to the Greeks, and we should be just studying them. And the moderns say, no, we can do better. But say, you look, for instance, something that I have studied a bit, and that's Jewish civilization. So the Jews are, more than anybody else, suffer from, or at least at that time, suffered from intellectual ancestor worship. You want to know something, go to the Talmud. In the Talmud steht alles. Everything is written in the Talmud. Well, it isn't. There's a lot of stuff in there, but not everything they ought to know. And so, for the Jews, for a very long time, remained captured by this ancestor worship. And then, at some point in the 19th century, they abandoned everything, and then you start getting people like Einstein. But that takes a long time. Whereas in the Europeans, already by the time in which, you see people, early 17th century, when the great minds like Galileo and Francis Bacon and René Descartes a little bit later, these people basically have already completely liberated themselves from this tyranny of ancestor worship. And I think that's truly amazing. And in China, there are attempts in that direction, but it fails. And certainly under the Manchu, the Qing dynasty, if anything, things become more and more conservative. The same is true in Islamic civilization. Not only that they were more conservative, they wouldn't even print books. The printing press isn't introduced in the Islamic world until late in the 18th century, so many, many years after it was introduced in Europe. And so that kind of conservative, maybe we should just call it a reaction, makes it very difficult to experience intellectual innovation.
Yeah.
And
so
I think, go ahead.
No. So you asked, to what can we attribute this rather unique cultural turn? And you say one of them is rather obvious. From the late 15th century on, Europeans were repeatedly confronted with discoveries that contradicted and received wisdom of the ancients, making classical science continuously lose credibility. So it is really sort of emerging new information that seems to contradict the status quo. So stuff like this wasn't happening elsewhere?
No, it wasn't happening elsewhere.
Yeah.
And if it was, then the conservative authorities were able to suppress it. And so the word, the idea of heresy, of somebody coming up with a new idea, and people say, this is heresy. Heresy basically means it's new and we don't like it.
Yeah.
And so, there's obviously an attempt in Europe to suppress heresy, and some of these were quite ugly events. We all know about it. Everybody knows about the Galileo trial and the burning of Giordano Bruno and Miguel Servetus. I mean, so there was some of that in Europe. But in the end, the project of repressing new knowledge in Europe by reactionary authority is a complete and total failure. And by the 18th century, when we have the Enlightenment going, essentially they no longer try this, okay? Everybody understands that suppressing new knowledge is not going to work, and you don't see a lot of heretics being burnt at the stake by 1750, They came again, sometimes there's a little bit of window dressing. They gave them a little bit of a slap on the wrist. So there's somebody like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who writes something that really annoys everybody. They say, this isn't nice. Go away for a few years, and then they burn a few books. But, they can burn a few books, but they don't burn Rousseau. So basically this fails in Europe. And at some point, essentially, the intellectual ancestor worship is completely abandoned. If you look today, I mean, the idea that we would go to ancient writings in order to learn anything about, there's always some eccentric people who believe in the literal, story of creation. There's even a creationist museum, but those people don't matter in some sense to the progress of science. But within modern science, and this is true not only in the hard sciences, it's equally true in economics. We're not interested in what people thought about in the field 50 or 200 years ago. We want the papers, the most recent papers, because newer is better.
So this is another ingredient that was needed. So you say change in attitudes was driven in part by institutional change.
Absolutely.
The new discoveries would not have been effective if, in overthrowing the classical orthodoxy, had it not been for an environment in which intellectual innovation was rewarded and incentivized, and moreover could not be effectively suppressed by conservatives and vested interests.
Exactly. So, and it's not like they're as I said, it's not like they're not trying, and everybody's really worried about it, and so there's a century of debate about the Copernican Revolution, say, okay, is Copernicus right or isn't he right? And what he said was obviously heretical, and he knew it. He was worried about it.
Right.
He wouldn't publish his book until a year before he died, and then there's a whole sort of story about how his publisher, in order to protect him, basically put in the introduction, well, you might think that he's saying something very rapid, but it doesn't really mean it. You just think it's maybe possible. There's all this waffling because they're worried about the Inquisition cracking down on him. But that's 1543. I think a century later, Galileo says this quite openly, and even he, gets into some measure of trouble. So that's a separate story.
Right.
But in the end, we all realize that the heliocentric hypothesis becomes victorious.
Yeah.
It had the advantage of being right.
So you call this sort of the market for ideas. And so the market for ideas became more active and more competitive, especially when the monopoly of the Catholic Church collapsed after 1517. So that is an important aspect also, right?
Absolutely. So I like to think about ideas as being traded in a market. I must say, not all social science idea, because the market here is a metaphor. It isn't really a market in which things are being bought and sold in the sense that a normal market would. There's really no price mechanism. But you can think about the market for ideas in which people come up with new ideas and they're trying to convince an audience that they've got it right. That's what I'm doing right now, if you want. But this is basically how modern knowledge advances. People come up with innovations and they're trying to convince an audience that, this is a new way of looking at things. So some of these things are very famous. Darwin writes The Origin of Species. That's an extremely successful product that he puts on the market, or, Einstein's relativity theory, that kind of thing. But most ideas are fairly small, minor things, but you go to and try to convince an audience that you've got it right. How do you do that? You publish, basically, or you give lectures, that kind of thing. And then if you make a sale, if you convince an audience, then what you gain is something called reputation. And so people will all know that so-and-so came up with that idea. And, that's nice for so-and-so because reputation is then correlated with what I call patronage. So, and so the people that's still true today. I mean, we don't call it patronage, we call it tenure. But this is what universities, is what universities do, right? I mean, how do people get tenure? I've been on, I don't know how many tenure meetings in my life. And basically what we're talking about is reputation. You go around the field and you ask people, hey, what do you think of so-and-so's work? And then you get letters and you get all kind of information. And you say, well, this person really merits tenure because other people in the field think his work is very good. And that's how a market works. And then the question is, to what extent is this market open? To what extent is it competitive? To what extent is it efficient? You can ask the kind of questions that economists ask about markets. And what I'm arguing in my book and in that essay is that the market for ideas in Europe at some point became increasingly efficient and worked far better, in large part because it was competitive, but also because there were, exogenous changes that made the market work better. You think above all about the printing press. So the printing press allows you to reach a much larger audience. But you can think about other things like better postal services, for instance. So people corresponded a lot, far more. Well, I'm not sure more than today, but certainly far more than, say, in the Middle Ages, because it was easier and cheaper to send letters around. Another thing that helped the market work very well is they had a lingua franca. They all wrote, at least until the middle of the 17th century, in Latin. And that helps because all the people who were intellectuals could read Latin and wrote Latin. And so there's a whole bunch of these circumstances that make this market work better. But the nice thing about it is that it's open. So basically you look at the people who left the mark, which is thousands and thousands, and of course that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of people we never even hear about. But these people are basically entering the market without any preconditions. You don't have to belong to a particular class. You don't have to come from a very rich family. You maybe not the poorest, because then you might never get an education. But a lot
but what was fascinating about that also, Joel, is that reputation at that time is sort of a soft currency, right? We don't, it is not sort of systematically tracked in publications and so on, but it seemed to have worked really well. And the incentives were in place. So you say that the desire for a secure and comfortable income, if not riches, was the main driver of scholarly efforts at that time.
Which it still is today. I mean, most professors that I know don't really expect to get rich. They just want to have enough to, have a nice house and have enough to eat and not worry. And the rest of and beyond that, all they want to do is leave me alone and let me do my work.
Right.
and it wasn't any different at that time, And so you look at somebody like, say, Galileo. I mean, simply his life is so well known. And, one day he gets a nice appointment from the Grand Duke in Florence, where he's made, court scientist, and he spends
Yeah.
many years sitting in Florence, and he doesn't have to teach, and he has a nice salary. He's not rich, but he's comfortable, and he writes his books and he does his research. He's surrounded by people who admire him and that kind of thing, and that holds for a large proportion of the people who played a role in this revolution. And obviously, this is what everybody wants. Now we only know about the successful cases, so we know about Newton, and we know about Leibniz, and we know about Huygens, and we know about the really, really superstars, and they all did fantastically well. But of course, this is what everybody wants. And so we have, for every successful person, we have 10 who are writing, who are adding to science, but somehow don't make it, okay? And these are sort of like the academics today who publish a few papers, don't get tenure, and end up driving Uber. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of people like that, and that's cruel, and it is maybe merciless. But that's how the system worked, and it worked in those days as well. You have a lot of people looking for patronage, but don't get it, and so that market is incredibly competitive. And the nice part about it, Jill, is that it isn't just on the supply side that it's competitive. It's also competitive on the demand side. So we have in Europe, certainly by that time, many universities who want to attract superstars, but we also have courts. And so a lot of these great scientists actually had non-academic jobs because courts wanted to have these people around for a variety of reasons.
They had influence, you say, right? The most desirable sign of success was influence. That is success in persuading others of the merits of a new idea or theory. Yeah.
Well, they had influence on each other, but what they really wanted, what the courts really wanted, they wanted to have, smart people around, and you can sort of see a whole bunch of these great rulers, and many of the smaller ones, like the Grand Duke of Florence, or Emperor Rudolf of Habsburg is a famous example. But even Louis XIV attracted to his courts of the great minds of Europe. He even made a job offer to Newton. This is well known. Newton, of course, never left England, and he wouldn't go to France. I mean, he was kind of a difficult guy. But he did attract, say, the great Italian astronomer Cassini. He attracted the great Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens. So people do this. Even Descartes, was eventually convinced to go to Stockholm and spend time at the court of the Queen, where poor man he got pneumonia in a terrible climate of Stockholm, and he died. But so people want to have these people around, and they compete for them. Much like American universities today are competing for the top economists and the top mathematicians and the top, whatever. And that system, that competitive system,
and it's also bringing sort of academic debate into the process, right? So you say here, innovative natural philosophers, in their eagerness to impress one another, and hence indirectly those who would extend patronage to them, increasingly dared to criticize a conventional wisdom, and if they only could, shot it to pieces. So, the idea to criticize, the idea to debate, seem to have really sprung up as well.
Yeah, and they criticize each other. They, it's not all good. I mean, they plagiarize each other, and the laws against plagiarism still weren't quite as sharp as they were today. And even today, people plagiarize each other, of course, but not maybe as common. There's a lot of that give and take going on, and it's extremely lively and extremely active. We're not talking about a very large population of people, depending a bit on how you define them. I would say, a few tens of thousands of people. But the nice thing about it, Jill, is that this is very pan-European. You can't really talk about English science or French science or German science or Spanish science. I mean, this is European science. There's something which they call the Republic of Letters. And people talk about this. This is a concept a term that's been around for a long time. And they say, we are not citizens of France or of England. We are citizens of the Republic of Letters. Now, this is to some extent a fiction, we should not overdo this. But I think there is a notion of identity there that is easy to overlook. People, these intellectuals really thought that they were part of a community to which they belonged and which defined their identity. And what is interesting is that community sets certain rules of that community, even though they weren't enforced rigorously by any government, but they were considered to be more or less binding. And one of the rules that and that sort of takes me back to my earlier argument, is what I call contestability. So there are no sacred cows in this society. This is embodied beautifully in the motto of the Royal Society, which is founded in 1660 in London. And the motto is in nullius verba, which is Latin for on no person's word, or, don't take anybody's word for it. And that basically means that, the fact that so-and-so said this doesn't make it true. You have to test, you have to re-examine, you have to challenge. That is how European science works at that time.
And what's also interesting here, Joel, is that, when we look at the properties of the system at the very high level, we see certain things, but you say it's neither design nor intent, but a classic emergent property. So the macro level, system-wide unintended consequences of lower level interactions. So, it just happened, so to speak, right?
Well, I think the notion of emergent property, I think, defines it really, really well. I mean, this is the result of thousands of lower level interactions between individuals writing to each other, reading books, corresponding, at times meeting each other also. That was fairly rare. And the notion of a republic of letters sort of emerges, even so nobody designed it, nobody ran it, nobody managed it. In principle, at least, or at least in theory, it was completely non-hierarchical. Now, that's obviously not all that exact in reality, because you always have superstars, and you look at how the English scientific community worked, and you realize that for a long time Isaac Newton basically ran it and was the sort of go-to guy. And there's a few other people like that elsewhere, but
another important point you make here is that it's about fragmentation. So you say European intellectual life that benefited from political fragmentation while maintaining cohesion within.
Yes.
In that sense, Europe could enjoy the benefits of both the polycentric political system and the economies of scale of a continent-wide community of scholars. That is really interesting, really important point, I think, right?
I think that's exactly right, and I stand by that statement. It's what you have to understand about Europe and how it differs from, say, a place like China. It isn't just that when you're looking at the map, you see a patchwork of, dozens and dozens of political units, some of them small, some of them large, but clearly nobody ever succeeded in creating a European empire that they ruled the way the Ming and the Qing ruled China. But it's more than that. Even within individual political units, there's a lot of competition, because what we have to understand is that European cities were to a large extent self-governing.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that within, say, France, they're competing with England, or they're competing with Spain, or the Habsburg. But within France, you have all these cities that are competing with each other. And the same is true in England, and the same is true in other countries that look like they are. Even in Spain, this is very true. Different regions and different towns competing with each other. So within each, so the competition takes place at a whole bunch of levels, and that's excellent. because you don't have that anywhere else. These autonomous cities are very much a European invention. Chinese cities were not self-governing. Islamic cities were not self-governing. It was all very highly centralized. And that's not true. That's not true in Europe. Cities have a lot of autonomy, a lot of decisions that they make, and the ruler really couldn't impose his or her will on them without facing the repercussions. So for a city, it's of course not just the relation with the ruler. It's we want to have. And that kind of phenomenon exists all over Europe. Now, you add to that the fact that there is religious competition. So after 1517, you get Protestantism, but you don't get one Protestantism. You get many Protestants. You get Calvinists, you got Lutherans, you got Baptists, you got all kinds of. And
right.
so, yeah, but that's extremely important because religious competition leads among many things, and it leads to ugly stuff. Obviously, we have religious wars, and they're pretty bloody-minded things. But what you see is that a part of this religious competition is that all religions start investing in education, and so a good example is the emergence of the Jesuit order. So the Jesuit order was explicitly set up to defend Catholicism against the threats of heresy, of Lutheranism. But what do the Jesuits do? They set up schools.
Right.
And the Jesuit schools all over. And the same is true in England. In England, you have the Church of England, and then you have these so-called dissenters.
Yeah.
And the dissenters who are, various other Protestant groups, but the dissenters they set up schools called dissenting academies, which are considered to be the best schools in England. And even people in the Church of England say, well, we don't believe in the dissenting religions, but I'm going to send my son to a dissenting academy because it's better than the local thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, so there's that level of competition within Europe.
Yeah.
Again, and if you think about it, in fact, this is the way competition works in all economic models. The efficiency of the competitive system is a classic emergent property. I'm not the first one to point that out, but it's clearly the case. So people come into a market and they don't want to make the system efficient, and they don't want to make. They just want to make money. But the competitive system forces them to behave in a particular way that eventually creates an efficient allocation of resources as an unintended consequence of this process. And I think the market for ideas, with some major differences, works the same way.
So another axis that appears quite critical for this process to work, you call it aptitude. And you say to make a difference in economic performance, the insights of natural philosophers and practical mathematicians had to be implemented. So engineering and artisans become a major ingredient here, right?
Absolutely. That I think is something that a lot of economic historians have overlooked. And so the way I put it to my students is I say, people had brilliant ideas throughout history. So a classic example of somebody who had a lot of interesting technological ideas is Leonardo, right? So we know this because his sketchbooks have survived, and everybody sort of gaped at these and see the wonders that he designed, the helicopter and and airplanes and all kind of machinery. Wonderful, except none of those was ever built during his lifetime because of the workmanship and the materials just weren't there. And what you need in order to translate technological ideas and new inventions into something that actually works is workmanship and materials. And those things need to be created. They are not, coming down like manna from heaven. They are the results of institutions and of culture themselves. But mostly, sometimes they are just a matter of good fortune. One way or another, I think what mattered in Europe is that I can document this fairly well, but there's still a lot of work to be done, is that the level of artisans and their capabilities over time improved dramatically, say, between 1400 and 1700.
And there's a hierarchy, bit of a hierarchy there, right? So,
Oh,
in
yeah.
the paper, you say, 3 levels of technological activity that drove innovation in this period. One is the major breakthroughs, and those I think we know them: James Watt, John
Sure.
Harrison, Samuel Crompton. But then you say, there are underneath that, there are major improvements to these innovations, which are equally critical for this to
Absolutely.
work, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so, and these are sort of minor improvements. I call them tweaks.
Yeah.
Um, and these tweaks, of course, matter a great deal because they are the ones where the productivity is really going up. So we actually can document this in particular sectors. There is, for instance, good evidence that in the watch industry. So two friends of mine wrote a famous paper on watches in the 18th century. And so what they do, they have never mind how they got this, but they got prices of watches that people paid when they bought them. And you can sort of see the price coming down at a rate of some over 1% a year after year after year. And why is that? Because of minor improvements in the quality of the materials and putting them together and better division of labor and, blah, blah, blah. And so we can actually see this happening over time. And there aren't any famous names associated with that, but we do see the outcome. And this is true for other industries as well. And so what you said about James Watt is, I think, is exactly right. There are a couple of famous names associated with the development of steam power. Of course, Thomas Newcomen, who built the first steam engine in 1712, and then, of course, Watt, who made a major improvement in it, and a few other famous names. But in fact, if you read the history of the steam engine, you realize that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these guys. They were almost all guys, I hate to say it, working on this problem and, making minor improvements here and there. And so you see the efficiency of these steam engines getting better. They're breaking down less frequently. They're easier to repair. Their movement is more even and more steady. They use less fuel. I mean, there's a whole bunch of dimensions in which these engines can be improved. Yeah. And, so people who are experts on this actually can identify a fair number of the less famous engineers who made this thing better. But this is quite crucial. You need to have a cadre of engineers, of technicians, of, as they're called, mechanics at this time, who do this. And if your mechanics are better than anybody else's, you will become the leader.
Yeah, another interesting point, Joel. You make a differentiation between France and Britain. You say the class of elite artisans in France was different from Britain's. France was missing something that Britain had in large quantities, namely the very skilled but unpretentious down-to-earth practical mechanics slaving away in the grimy workshops of Leeds, whereas French mechanics catered to the fashions and whims of the rich and glamorous rather than the needs of the masses. That's an interesting difference as well. And so it's not only the existence of that hierarchy that you talked about, but also at the bottom of the hierarchy, there's a question of focus.
Yes.
Or what you're trying to accomplish.
I think that's absolutely right. Now, in the end, that difference mattered a lot less than you would think, for the very simple reason that what happens in France is that a lot of Brits come over to France and help them set up their industries because they want to be part of the game too. And so when you look at the French cotton industry, for instance, what they do is they say, well, we can't quite get this to work. And so they bring in these British mechanics, which is partially illegal and it's difficult because of the war between the two. So there's wonderful stories there. But when you come right down to it, you can see that the Brits are, because they have better mechanics than everybody else, they spread all over Europe. and they set up these factories and these machineries. And that's not just in France; it's everywhere. And so, if you go to the city of Donetsk in the eastern Ukraine, you will see, maybe to your surprise, a big statue of a man called John Hughes, who was a Welshman actually. And and actually the town was called Yuzova for many years after Hughes. Okay, now it's called Donetsk, and in between it was called Stalino. We know after whom that is. And but basically, John Hughes got into Russia by the Tsar's officials to help them set up an iron industry, because they didn't know how to do it and they didn't have the skills. But so they brought in somebody from England. They paid it very well. They gave him probably a nice house. I don't actually know that, but I'm guessing here. And it was probably, and they probably fed him a lot of vodka. But he set up the iron industry, and you see these people in Spain, you see them in the Netherlands, you see them in Belgium, you see them in Germany, in the Habsburg Empire. These Brits, and so in some sense, I think Britain was the leader only temporarily because they couldn't keep it there, and that is very much because Europe is this sort of coherent intellectual community, and you just couldn't keep things at home. People move around,
and the training, right? The training. So, you say skilled artisans were trained in formal and informal apprenticeship relations with existing masters. So Europe's master artisans thus produced two different outputs: material goods and technical training for the next generation. And it appears that they had a lot of flexibility as to where to go for the apprenticeship program.
Yeah, so this is a line of papers that I've developed over the last, I don't know, decade or so.
Yeah.
And basically, my argument is something like that. So there's a lot of talk in economics about human capital, okay? And, you go to the development literature, and, people think it's great, some people think it's not, but people talk about human capital. What's human capital? It's when, whether you went to school, how many years you spent in school, how good the school was, blah, blah, blah. And the interesting thing, of course, is that in much of history, artisans rarely went to school. The way they became artisans is that they were taught by another artisan. That's what we call apprenticeship. And that's a universal concept. We know that there's apprenticeship in the Roman Empire because there's documented there were apprentices in ancient Greece. And, throughout the Middle Ages, people had to be taught. If you were going to become a carpenter or a blacksmith or a tailor, somebody had to teach you this, and you couldn't go to engineering school if you were going to become a millwright.
Yeah.
So who taught you? Well, either your father, and in many cases it was your father or your uncle, or somebody that your parents contracted with to train you. And what I am arguing in Europe is that, and particularly in Britain, but elsewhere as well, is that this system worked better in Europe than anywhere else for a variety of reasons, and that over time these European apprentices get, the system in which they are trained gets better and better, and the net result, of course, is better aptitudes, because that's where you learn it. You learn it from somebody else.
Yeah. So so both attitude and aptitude seem to have played a major role in this difference between Europe and the rest of the world. And we can observe some things here, right? So you say there is no reason to think that by the time Europeans reached Asia, and European artisans were on average more skilled than their colleagues in India, China, or Japan, they were approximately the same. Yet by 1600, there are signs of an opening gap in some areas. So Europe was pulling ahead in basic mechanical technology, screws, levers, pulleys, as well as optical instruments, printing, hydraulic technology, and precision mechanisms such as clocks, watches, toys, musical instruments, and guns. And so the observation here is, in a shorter time frame, right? You could actually see this happening within a few decades.
Well, that's, I think, when it sort of when the flower starts blooming, so to speak. And that's during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
At some point in the middle of the 18th century, many of those plants that had been growing, all of a sudden starts flowering, and you start seeing new inventions coming to the fore. And then, within a very short time, you see Europeans obviously outmaneuvering everybody else. So, the classic example that Karl Marx was already writing about is how the cotton industry, which had been endemic in India for centuries, and Europeans were importing these cotton goods from India, these calicos that they wanted so badly because these Indian artisans were so good at making them. And then in the 19th century, we see the flows of cotton reversing. It's instead of India exporting cottons to England, England exporting them to India because, quite frankly, there are other things going on here, colonial relationship and so on. But the basic thing is that Europeans were better at it than Indians, and the Indians couldn't compete. I mean, that sounds very, very cruel, but that is precisely how it was. The Indians couldn't compete unless they got a hold of the machinery that the British had developed, mules and power looms and things like that the Europeans had developed, and that simply made a cheaper and better product. And the Indians just couldn't compete. And, the same is true for the Islamic world. The same is true for China. I mean, Europeans are clearly making better products over time because they are more skilled and they have better machinery. And then they have the skills to build the machinery, to maintain the machinery, to improve the machinery. And so I think that creates this gap between the West and the rest. And
and there's also I don't know this, Joel, but I was wondering, there's also a critical scale issue, right? Once you reach it, it's a lot easier to go a lot faster further. And so, some of the ingredients here again, you say many of the institutions of public science, such as scientific societies and academies, were aimed at the demonstrations of the miracles that science could accomplish. In private gatherings and coffee houses, inns and domestic residences, scientists and artisans met one another and exchanged ideas. So there is a culture that is rapidly developing, and we can measure the outputs of that, which seems fantastic.
Absolutely. And I think that, I am not incredibly taken by the concept that scale in and of itself was all that important. I mean, compare England to China. Okay, so, China is, I don't know, maybe the population of China is 50 times what it was in England. I don't have the numbers here in front of me, but that's the right order of magnitude. So we're talking, if you needed scale and scale alone, or number of people, China would beat anybody else. It's vast and it's fairly coherent. There is a lingua franca, there is an administration. So scale worked in favor of China, but clearly scale is neither necessary nor sufficient. And so, but I think what you're absolutely right about is that what happens in Europe is because intellectual activity is continent-wide, in the sense that if you write a paper in Edinburgh, or if you invent something in somewhere else, it will flow elsewhere. A paper written in Edinburgh within a year or two would be read in Stockholm, in Warsaw, in Berlin, in Madrid, and in Naples. We know this because, in fact, some of these things you can trace. And so you have all this fragmentation and people who spoke different languages and had different religions and didn't like each other particularly much, but they will read each other's papers and books. And I think that is really, this amazing European phenomenon that, as you said, it creates this emergent property of Europe pulling ahead scientifically and technologically for a long time.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Joel, I want to get your insights into, if you look at today, So what your paper is suggesting is that this interaction between natural philosophers, let's call them designers, and artisans, let's call them the producers. So designers and producers, so to speak, that interaction was very critical. Now today we sort of have that in a in a different way, right? So we have a lot of the designs being done in the US. We have a lot of the tangible goods being produced in China, a lot of the software goods produced in India. And so, this type of a specialization, if countries start to specialize in this way, what do you think? Does it have some downside? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't used to think that it had a downside because until not that long ago, I thought this was a fantastic system, and that what people call somewhat fleetingly globalization, which is what you describe basically, was going to keep producing very rapidly expanding prosperity. I think for a variety of reasons, this globalization has experienced some setbacks in recent years, and countries are maybe less willing to depend on others for essential ingredients of their prosperity. And I think international cooperation and trust have taken a beating. I think we all know why, and I don't think the epidemic helped. But it's really multilateral. I don't think any particular country or any particular politician is to blame. I think the entire global culture of cooperation and trust has taken a beating in the last 15, 20 years, and that saddens me a great deal because, as you say, world prosperity depends a great deal on an international division of labor. That said, I want to add quickly a point that isn't made enough to my, and that is that competition between major blocks. I don't think it's competition between nations now. There's competition between major blocks. China is a major block. The EU is a major block. North America is a major block. The competition between them, as long as it doesn't degenerate into the outright hostility, has, I think, favorite consequences. Because what will happen is that if new technology comes around and for some reason one block fails to adopt it, then the other block will. And of course, if the first block knows that the other block will, then they will be more willing to adopt this new technology. So you think about, for instance, something that I'm actually feel very keenly about, and that is genetic engineering. So there's a lot of resistance to genetic engineering, much of it for, irrelevant reasons or immaterial reasons. But the point is that, the nations that object to genetic engineering, try to make it impossible, will have to contend with the fact that if they don't do it, somebody else will, and eventually will outsell them with superior products. And I think that's true across the board for lots of things. So you can try to ban certain products, but that will not work. And that in some sense is a lesson that you can learn from the European experience in the 17th century. That everybody, a lot of people didn't like the new technology, but they said, look, if we don't adopt it, those other guys will. And so we have to do it. And so the best example of all that I can find of this is the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And, we all remember, well, I do remember, you probably don't, but I remember the kind of shock that went to the Western world in 1957 and 1958 when the Soviets first launched Sputnik and then shot Yuri Gagarin into space. And everybody said, oh my God, we need to do something because these other guys will get ahead of us and that will be a disaster. And so the net result was not just that Americans put a man on the moon, but that a whole sort of slew of technological and scientific progress was driven by this concern that the Soviets would get ahead of us. And I think that kind of phenomenon we still have today. And so, I have mixed feelings about this, because sometimes these things go wrong, and then they go wrong, they can go very wrong, like in 1914. But as long as it stays within these boundaries, that's, I think, actually kind of healthy. So, so this is sort of a double-edged sword.
Yeah. It's information is democratized, so it is very difficult to sort of circumvent certain innovations by regulation. So I think if I understand your point correctly, Joel, what you're saying is that localized regulation in a specific area, in a specific block, is not going to work because somebody else is going to do it and then basically sell you back the products.
Or if you don't buy it, your living standards will fall. I mean, that's just exactly. I think that's exactly how it works, and that is the nature of the competitive process. You're not really free to do as you please, as you would if you were a monopolist, because you always have to worry about the people around you.
Right. Yeah, we didn't get to the other papers, Joel. We ran out of time, but this has been great. And
I know.
Thanks so much for spending time with me. And
this was great fun. Will you send me a copy of the blog when it comes out? I take it you're going to edit this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll do that tomorrow for sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Excellent.
Thanks so much. Bye.
All right, my pleasure.
Stay safe.
You too. Okay, bye-bye.